Thank you, and thanks to Joe and the organisers for the invitation. It's very good to be back, and particularly good to be talking about this subject, which is one that I feel very passionately about. Culture. We talk a lot about culture these days. The dysfunctional culture of the HSE, the culture of concealment in the Catholic Church, the culture of entitlement in organisations like FORCE. This morning, the three speakers speaking on this subject of political reform all spoke about political culture. And I think most people who think about politics in this country talk about political culture and say that our political culture needs to change and there are problems with our political culture. And I think many people in the academic community included believe that the primary problem with our politics relates to issues with political culture. Sometimes I think that maybe, and it's very useful to think about culture and organizational culture, but sometimes I think it may be overused, and that there's too much of a focus on the issue of culture and not enough focus on the issue of institutions. And let me give a parallel with this that I think most people could relate to. In most schools, and teachers, particularly teachers, notice this over time, that you get classes that are just more difficult than other classes. Whatever it is, with a group of individuals involved in the same school, you get different individuals, whatever way they spark off each other, teachers will find one particular class, for no particular reason, more difficult to deal with. They may be more disruptive in class, they may give more trouble to the teacher, they're less inclined to do homework. You could call that the culture of that particular class. Now, how do you change that culture? Well, a lot of people, going back to our politics, say, we kind of need to change our political culture. We need to do things differently. People need to vote in different ways, so we're less locally focused, for example, or that we don't elect politicians that have been associated with corruption, or that our politicians do things differently, so they focus on things that matter for the benefit of everyone, not just their constituents, and getting elected the next time round. I don't think, just as a teacher who might go into that class every day and says, you are the most difficult class in the school, you've got to do better, you've got to work harder, you've got to be better in the class. That teacher could say that every year for those kids who are in school, and those kids are not going to change behavior. People don't change their behavior, and culture doesn't change simply by people saying, really, it's not good enough, you must change. If you want to change the behavior of that school, how are you going to do it? Well, maybe you would break up the class. In some bigger schools, you've got a number of different years, a number of different classes in a particular year. Maybe you break it up. Over the summer, you'd say, right, this class is just unmanageable, let's break it up. So you rearrange it. Or you might take some of the most difficult kids out of the class and hope that'll change the dynamic or the culture in the class. You could change the penalties and sanctions for kids. You could say to kids who are repeatedly disruptive, no, it's not just going to detention week after week, you're going to get suspended. And then we're going to go through a process where you may be expelled. So the penalties for bad behavior increase. So my point is that you change culture and behavior by changing what you might broadly speak of as institutions. And this brings us to the political, back to the political system and the importance of our Constitution. The Constitution really is Donegal used management speak, I prefer to use architecture. It's the blueprint for the superstructure of the state, within which it provides the parameters within which things operate. And I think it's extremely important that although talking about constitutional issues may seem very abstract, in fact it's absolutely essential in determining the culture and the outcomes from a political culture. And changing our Constitution, in my view, is absolutely essential because our Constitution is in fact extremely unusual in the democratic world. And in my view also, it hasn't worked. And many of the things that have happened in our country and why we've underperformed as a country seems to me to be closely related to the very unusual constitutional framework and architecture that we have. And with a constitutional convention coming up, there is a golden opportunity to change that and reorganize. So just as you reorganize an underperforming class to make sure the kids come out better educated than they would otherwise do, by rearranging the superstructure of the state, you can improve the outcomes and make sure that we govern ourselves, or certainly hope that we can govern ourselves in a better way. One of the very unusual, well, let me backtrack a little. One of the most important, after universal suffrage, everybody having the right to vote, the most important political innovation ever was the notion that the state could be, what the state does could be divided up into three broad areas. That you have one area that makes laws, you've got one area that implements laws, and one body that polices the laws. So you've got the Parliament or the legislature, you've got the executive or the government, and you've got the judiciary. And the notion is that by ensuring that each of those is as powerful as the other, that they have their own areas but they touch off each other, that they check each other to make sure that one doesn't encroach the area of the other, by an act of genius, that these three forces bounce off each other in a way that you don't get abuses of power, or you minimize abuses of power because they're checking each other, and they're checking up on each other in a way that each branch performs in an effective way. Now, one of the things that makes our Constitution so unusual, we really don't have that separation of powers that exists in most democracies in the world. One of the most unusual aspects is that the government, the executive branch of government, as Professor John Coakley pointed out this morning, Ireland is very, very unusual in its insistence, the Constitution's insistent that every member of the government is simultaneously a member of the Oireachtas. Most countries, because of the separation of powers, it makes more effective and more accountable government, they split the roles. And this is an element that makes Ireland very, very different, and it, in my view, accounts for the iron law of inertia, that things don't happen. It's often been said that the machinery of the Irish state is a British machine that's been kept ticking over the years. So we haven't fundamentally reformed our state. Things like the public service. Public service still looks more like the British public service in the middle of the last century. Very little reform in the public service, all the way down to small things one that's topical at the moment is bankruptcy laws. We have Dickensian bankruptcy laws. Why over the years did nobody take the time to modernize and bring our bankruptcy laws up to date? And then when crisis hits, it has to be done. So things don't happen, and I think one of the big reasons things don't happen is how the average minister looks at what he has to do. And I'm going to use he rather than he, she all the time. Nothing intended by that, just to save time, so Bridget won't be squeeze more in. Imagine the average minister arriving at a department after election and he's been appointed. If he hasn't shadowed that area, really, he may not have very much knowledge about, say, health. If he's appointed to health, he may not have huge knowledge of health. He faces running a huge organization. Most TDs don't have experience of managing very large organizations. So he's got to try and read himself into the hugely complex area of health, run an organization with tens of thousands of people without having experience of having done that before. This is an extremely difficult thing to do. Now, at the same time, he remains a local representative. So he's got to conduct his clinics, go to the constituency, keep his political machine in the constituency going, and keep an eye on his competitors. He's also a politician, and one of the big things politicians have to do these days is to feed the 24-hour media beast. So there's press releases, interviews for radio, for press, for TV, a very big time-consuming part of being a politician. As a senior member of his party, has to do a lot of the meetings, purely party meetings, fundraisers, the golf classics, the rubber chicken dinners. All of these things are things that most politicians, senior politicians, are obliged to do. As a minister, he's also got to attend cabinet meetings, and most cabinet ministers now spend considerable time shuttling back and forth to Brussels because the EU dimension to government is now so important. So on top of all of that, he's got to try and get to grips with something as big and as complicated as, say, the health, whether it's health, education, welfare, whatever it is. Being a minister is a huge job that requires really a lot of expertise, a lot of work, a lot of commitment. But in this country, we commit ourselves to making sure that all of our ministers have this huge number of things to do. And it really is no wonder that so little happens, given the workload and how much we expect of our ministers. One of the most fundamental changes that we could make, and not a radical change, but simply making our constitution more like other countries, would be to turn Article 28(7) around. Instead of saying that every minister has to be a member of the Oireachtas, say that ministers cannot be members of the Oireachtas. So, if a TD decided, was offered a job as a minister, he would have to give up his seat. And he could have a seat at the cabinet, or he could have a seat in the Oireachtas, but he can't have both. And that really is the norm in most countries. When one brings this up, I think often people say they can be convinced on the effectiveness thing that it makes sense. Yeah, it's just too much to expect anybody to do in a modern world, to be able to do as many jobs as that and to do them all effectively. But some people feel, right, well, not democratically elected. Well, what happens in most countries is that you have two types of ministers. You have elected representatives who then give up their job. They become full-time members of the government, and they're no longer ministers. So I don't think anybody would feel there's a democratic deficit issue there. Some people do have feel that there's a democratic deficit issue, that if you appoint somebody as a non-politician to a ministerial role. In other countries, most people feel it's exactly the opposite, that you actually get more accountability. And a couple of reasons for that. Most other countries, there is a confirmation hearing process that the government may appoint a minister, but the ministers, the appointed ministers, before they actually get the seal of office, have to sit before a parliamentary committee that grills them to see if they are up to the job. And the parliamentary committee has the power to veto them. And this happens in the European Parliament, it happens in the US Congress, that if the parliamentary committee rejects the government's or the president in the US case, the minister, they can say no. So that is related to Parliament. Give Parliament extra powers to veto those ministers means at that point, before they're even appointed, there's a greater control over the executive. When ministers are not one of the people in Parliament and have no real deep links with the parliamentarians and don't meet the parliamentarians in the parliamentary bar and canteen and restaurant, those personal contacts don't exist. So when that person then comes before the various committees, people are more likely to be tough with the minister concerned. So I think there's a big benefit. And the final area is that, and this is particularly the case in this country, that Taoiseach are very reluctant to sack ministers. So if you imagine, let's imagine somebody like Patrick Honan, who often strikes me as being an almost identikit European finance minister, professorial demeanour, beard, expert, very similar to a lot of that bat I think is attracting. So compare the sort of accountability that a parliament might give to him vis-a-vis Michael Noonan. So Michael Noonan now is a TD. He knows the people on his own side who are the biggest party. Are they likely to give him a grilling as much as they would give Patrick Honan a grilling if he was finance minister? So I think in that sense it also creates a distance between the people in government and the parliamentarians, who are then more inclined to be tougher with them when they come before parliamentary committees. And a final aspect about the strengthening of the executive, which some people often say, and quite correctly, that the executive dominates the legislature, the government dominates the Oireachtas, and that's absolutely true. But then people may think from that the government, the executive, is actually strong in Ireland. For the reasons outlined, it's not, and it actually needs more strength. And again, coming back to that example of a minister who arrives at a department on his first day, he has to go in and face what is often called the permanent government, the civil service, who have the detail, are familiar with the issues, have had a career dealing with the issues, a very difficult thing to do. Something that happens in Brussels, Maura Geoghegan-Quinn, for example, when she was appointed to the current position she had, she's entitled to have 7 advisors, a team of advisors that she can pick from different areas to help her prioritise her agenda, manage the stakeholders involved, and drive the agenda with the European Parliament and the other stakeholders involved. It strikes me that it really is essential, given the complexity of modern government, to be able to put a team of advisors around ministers, to separate them from the civil service and give them that extra ability to push an agenda. Now, that doesn't need to be in the Constitution, but so many of the political parties have often appointed political hacks that I think there's a lot of distrust about political advisors in this country, and in some cases, rightly so. Perhaps one way of dealing with that is putting in the Constitution that there has to be some sort of vetting process of advisors so that people can feel confident that advisors who are appointed are serious people who are capable of doing the job and are not simply there because of their party affiliation and their loyalty to a particular individual in that party. And those are the kind of things that could allow a more proactive government to do the sort of things in the good times that we had a long period of, that would have laid the foundations and lessened many of the very bad things that have turned out to happen if we had a more proactive and effectively normally designed system of government. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.